This episode of Worlds Turned Upside Down is made possible with support from a 2024 grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Soyechtowa and 3 other indigenous warriors watched in silence from near the banks of Sinking Creek in western Virginia as Balthazar Liebrook walked to his grist mill. The mill sat where the creek entered the new river. The sounds of laughter and the swift footsteps of children drowned out the sound of Liebrook's own boots as they headed for the creek to play in the shallow water and enjoy the pleasant day. It was Sunday, August 7th, 1774. For several days now, Liebrook, his wife Catherine, their children, and the Sidnow and McGriff families had been taking refuge inside Liebrook's blockhouse, a hastily constructed fort built to protect themselves from indigenous war parties, then raiding throughout the backcountry. In recent days, provincial militia had seen signs of Soyechtowa and his men in the area. Tracks through the woods, scattered sightings, a burned home. 20 years earlier, such raids had devastated settler communities in the Pennsylvania and Virginia backcountries during the 7 Years' War. A violence renewed in its wake during Pontiac's uprising. A violence that returned in recent years as new treaties redrew the border between British and indigenous America, intensifying a rivalry between Pennsylvania and Virginia that propelled settlers west towards the Ohio country into native homelands. Earlier that spring, Virginians, known to indigenous people in the region as the Long Knives, had lured several Mingo men and women into a trap. The Mingos, a community of mostly Seneca and Cayuga peoples from the Six Nations Iroquois, had migrated west into the Ohio country in the mid-18th century. One Mingo village sat near the mouth of Yellow Creek, where it empties into the Ohio River, over 300 miles north of the Liebrook farm. On April 30th, 1774, several unsuspecting Mingo canoed down the Yellow Creek and crossed the Ohio River to visit a tavern built along the riverbank, where the Long Knives massacred 8 of them. From across the river, the attackers heard the wails of Mingo women who knew what the Virginians had done. Soyechtowa's mother, brother, and sister were among the dead. 4 months later, and 300 miles to the south, their deaths still haunted him as he watched Balthazar Liebrook head for his grist mill and the children splash in Sinking Creek. White settlers knew Soyechtowa as James Logan, his English name, or simply Logan. He was born in the 1720s to Neonoma, his Cayuga mother, and Shekhalemi, his Oneida father. Few native leaders did more to shape the relationship between British provinces like Pennsylvania and indigenous nations in the early 18th century than Shekhalemi. The Six Nations Iroquois tasked Shekhalemi to speak for the Shawnee and the Delaware, over whom the Six Nations claimed dominion. He negotiated land sales and treaties with the Pennsylvania government that protected the Six Nations' homelands, often at the expense of other native nations. He grew close to James Logan, the colony's chief diplomat to indigenous communities, and honored their friendship by giving 2 of his sons, including Soyechtowa, the English name Logan. Shekhalemi had raised his sons in that world of diplomacy, but by the early 1770s, Shekhalemi's way had given over to renewed and violent rivalries between Virginians and Pennsylvanians for native lands, and between indigenous nations and white settlers for the Ohio country. That violence would claim the lives of his wife and 2 of his children along the banks of the Ohio River in the Yellow Creek Massacre. Indigenous customs permitted the aggrieved to assuage their mourning by covering the graves of the dead and afforded them the right of revenge. That right brought Soyechtowa, the man most colonists knew as James Logan, deep into the Virginia backcountry on August 7, 1774, to the junction of Sinking Creek and the New River, to the Liebrook farm. despite the danger, the Liebrook, Sidnow, and McGriff families thought it was safe enough to let their children out of the blockhouse to get some air and stretch their legs after days of confinement. Balthazar Liebrook was inside his grist mill when Logan and the 3 other warriors who had been watching silently nearby sprang from their hiding place with war cries that the survivors never forgot. They descended on the 11 children playing and canoeing in the creek. The oldest child was 14, the youngest mere months old. Some of them tried to run, some of them tried to paddle away, some were so petrified at the sight of the armed men running toward them, they could not move. Liebrook couldn't hear the screams of the children over the noise of his gristmill. He had no idea anything was wrong until one of Logan's warriors burst into the mill and shot him in the arm. He managed to evade the warrior, finding refuge in a nearby cave and escape with his life, but only just barely. Most of the children did not. Logan and his men took 7 scalps from the Liebrook farm. They departed with 3 other children as captives. But Logan did leave something behind. Hours after the attack, Lieutenant John Draper and a detachment of 20 men arrived near the scene. They had been searching for Logan and his war party since that morning. They had found the war party's tracks in the woods, but Logan and his men had cleverly concealed their movements, leaving the militiamen befuddled and the warriors unseen. But in their searching, they found what Logan wanted them to find. Near the site of the attack, one of Draper's men found a war club lying on the ground. It was nearly 2 feet long, carved out of hard wood with a dense ball at its top. A metal spike protruded out of it, a weapon to make short work of those who fell beneath its blow. On the handle, the militiamen found letters carved into the tip. L.G. Logan. The war club was a message, a statement that Logan had done what he believed he must do to avenge the deaths of his family. And it served as a warning, to frighten others who might make war on them. For at that very moment, as delegates prepared to meet in Philadelphia for a Continental Congress to debate the course of human events in the East, the royal governor of the Long Knives was recruiting an army to come west, to capture the forks of the Ohio River for Virginia, and conquer the Ohio country for his colony once and for all. I'm Jim Ambuske, and this is Worlds Turned Upside Down, a podcast about the history of the American Revolution, Episode 21, The Vengeance. In the summer of 1773, John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, arrived at Fort Pitt at the forks of the Ohio River. The Scottish nobleman had once lamented his appointment as Virginia's royal governor, but the prospect of claiming the West for Virginia had given him a renewed sense of purpose. In recent years, new treaties with the Susquehannock nations, the Cherokee and the Haudenosaunee, who colonists knew as the Six Nations Iroquois, had remade the map of British America. These agreements opened up millions of acres in the West to white settlement at the expense of the Ohio nations. But those treaties also drove a deeper wedge between Virginians and Pennsylvanians, who vied for possession of the backcountry. They triggered a renewed competition between the provinces in a decades-old rivalry for command and control of the rivers, the mountains, and the woods of the Ohio country. Virginians, like the planter and Continental Congressman George Washington, and Pennsylvanians, like the Scottish immigrant and British officer Arthur St. Clair, believed that their colonies had valid claims to the region, claims bolstered by charter rights, commerce, and war.
The Ohio Company builds a road from Cumberland, Maryland to Pittsburgh at their own expense as a way of conducting trade from Virginia to the forks of the Ohio. But in the middle of the 7 Years' War, General Forbes cuts another road that's basically the Pennsylvania Turnpike that will funnel Philadelphia and Pennsylvanians to the fort. And Washington, when it's built in 1758, says, uh-oh, this is a big problem. My name is Robert Parkinson, and I am a professor of history at Binghamton University. Both Pennsylvania and Virginia have not only their eyes set on this as the key to a whole lot of things because of the way the river traffic works, but they both think it's theirs for different reasons. Virginia says it was ours. It was Virginians that had it, but the Pennsylvanians say, no, it's ours. And as long as there are redcoats in Fort Pitt, that's fine. And there's just unofficial trading going on.
When Dunmore entered the star-shaped walls of Fort Pitt in 1773, however, the redcoats were gone. With costs mounting and unrest rising in the east, the British had withdrawn the army garrison in the west, leaving the forks of the Ohio open for the taking. Dunmore wanted it for Virginia, to at last settle the argument with Pennsylvania and extend the Old Dominion into new lands. So, why did Virginians and Pennsylvanians all but wage a civil war for control of the West? How did indigenous calculations reshape the imperial landscape? And how did choices made in distant capitals and diplomatic conferences transform the lives of settlers and native peoples on the ground? To begin answering these questions, we'll first head back to 1768, back to Fort Stanwix in northern New York, to redraw part of the border between British and indigenous America. We'll then travel southwest into the disputed Ohio country to contend with the British withdrawal from Fort Pitt, before paddling along the rivers and lakes throughout the region to witness the consequences of choices made in an intimate war that for some seemed to have no end. In the fall of 1768, Sir William Johnson traveled from his home along the Mohawk River to Fort Stanwix in northern New York, consumed with planning the final details of upcoming treaty negotiations that would have far-reaching personal and imperial implications. Johnson was the Crown-appointed Superintendent for Indian Affairs for the Northern District. He was charged with managing George III's relationship with indigenous peoples in the northern colonies and the Ohio country. The Haudenosaunee were the key to the Irish-born superintendent's power and influence in British America, as well as London. He had convinced the Six Nations to break their neutrality during the 7 Years' War and side with the British, and his diplomatic successes in the years since were due in no small measure to the power and influence of his wife, Conwatsutsiani, or Molly Brant, a prominent member of the Mohawk Nation. Johnson's treaty negotiations at Fort Stanwix were meant to address vexing issues that had remained unresolved since the end of the war.
Part of the problem comes from the Proclamation of 1763. It cuts off parts of North America from white settlement and development. My name is Christopher Pearl. I'm an associate professor of history and co-director of American Studies at Lycoming College. Typically, it's shown down the Appalachian Mountains. The proclamation line also bars purchase even east of those lines, so territories that have not been purchased from native peoples previous to the 1763 proclamation. It was very difficult at that point for people to figure out how to extend the line if it was so necessary. And there are a lot of people angling to extend the line.
In the months and years after George III's royal proclamation of October 1763, British and native diplomats began negotiating and surveying segments of a boundary line past which white settlement would be forbidden. 2 years later, in 1765, when Johnson began treating with the Haudenosaunee to lay out the northern boundary, the Susquehanna River in central Pennsylvania loomed large on the map, a river and a region of intense interest to the governments of Pennsylvania and Connecticut, private land companies, powerful indigenous nations, and displaced native peoples. At the conference, the Haudenosaunee traced a line beginning in Owego, New York, and then followed the Susquehanna River
down the North Branch to the east of the North Branch, and then to the southeast of the East Branch, and then to the south of the West Branch going over to Ohio, carving out that entire territory from white settlement and development.
However,
they also refused to bargain north of Owego, which is near modern-day Binghamton, for a line that would extend north of Owego to Canada Creek up near the top of New York, near Canada. William Johnson realizes this is not a deal that any of the other interests will want. The Pennsylvanians won't want it. The Connecticut government nor the Susquehanna Company will want it. He doesn't want it because he wants the deal north of Owego. Nevertheless, he makes it seem finalized to the Haudenosaunee, to the refugee peoples. He makes it seem finalized to even some government officials like Thomas Gage. And this matters because Johnson figured that he was going to be the one to finalize that deal in another treaty.
Johnson's subterfuge did not buy him as much time as he had hoped.
In the in-between, King George III has appointed a new Secretary of the Colonies, Wills Hills, Lord Hillsborough, who sees much of what the colonists are doing and even what Sir William Johnson is doing as colonial truculence. Benjamin Franklin believes that he's fearful of these land agreements that extends American jurisdiction because much of Lord Hillsborough's income comes from rents on his Irish estates.
Here's Robert Parkinson.
Lord Hillsborough has 100,000 acres of land in County Down, Ireland. His number one job is to make sure his Irish tenants don't get on boats and go to America. He is petrified of losing all of his tenants. Immigration from the British Isles is exploding to America after the 7 Years' War. As Franklin says, Hillsborough is terribly afraid of dispeopling Ireland.
Hillsborough sends Johnson instructions, once he takes office, that he is to finalize the 1765 agreement and that it must follow what was agreed upon in 1765. He calls it his precise instructions on the authority of the Crown. Not only does he tell him it needs to be the same, he sends him a map that designates the exact line that the Haudenosaunee agreed to in 1765.
Despite Hillsborough's rigid instructions and his own self-interest, numerous indigenous nations, several colonial governments, private individuals, and corporate interests were all keen to extend and redraw the line. Millions of acres in the Susquehanna and the Ohio River valleys, as well as the sovereignty rights of native nations, were all at stake.
William Johnson wants to extend the line. He sees this as necessary because there are already encroachments on Native American land past the 1763 proclamation. He's also hearing rumors that he's going to lose his position and his status. And that's partly because the British government are trying to cut what they consider costly indigenous alliances. And those costly indigenous alliances have often elevated the status of the Haudenosaunee in British diplomacy. Johnson made his career on that elevation of the Haudenosaunee. And so Johnson wants to use a new deal to extend the line to not only gain that new territory, but to also reaffirm the relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the British government, and the Haudenosaunee over the tributaries who had been claiming independence during the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War.
Johnson had other reasons for wanting to alter the line as well.
He's also personally vested. He has been given a grant of about 25,000 acres from the Mohawk that is effectively outlawed by the Proclamation of 1763 because it's a purchase that would have happened after that proclamation. He also has a purchase for over 100,000 acres from the Oneida that is, again, in dispute. Johnson has a personal interest to extend the line because that would hypothetically bring those purchases in, or those grants in, as legal.
Connecticut was also intensely interested in the outcome of future negotiations.
Connecticut is claiming vast sections of the northern Susquehanna River Valley, if not the whole of the northern Susquehanna River Valley, as part of their charter rights. There's the Susquehanna Company, which is a speculator company that claims that they purchased much of this land from the Haudenosaunee at the Albany Congress in 1754, but they're basing their claims back on those charter rights. The Connecticut government, or the Susquehanna Company more particularly, wants to see an extension of the line so that they can start shifting their focus west from their base of operations in Wyoming in the northern Susquehanna River Valley. They're eyeing the West Branch, but that's effectively off limits right now because of the proclamation line and what's been purchased, even at Albany by the Susquehanna Company.
Connecticut's claims did not go unchallenged.
You also have the Pennsylvania government that claims by their charter rights that the northern Susquehanna River Valley is within the territory that the Penns claim within Pennsylvania, but not purchased of the Native Americans.
The question of who had the right or authority to negotiate an agreement for the Susquehanna River Valley only compounded the challenges diplomats faced at the upcoming conference at Fort Stanwix.
By 1768, you have two settler governments that are claiming it. You have the Haudenosaunee who are claiming it. You have refugee native peoples that are claiming it. But you also have the Ohio nations that see clan and kinship connections with many of the Susquehanna nations that are living in the northern Susquehanna River Valley. They also claim jurisdiction over much of that northern Susquehanna River Valley on the West Branch. Do you negotiate with the people who live there, Lenape, Shawnee, Nanticoke, Conoy, Tutelo, etc., or is it the Haudenosaunee who claims them as tributary people? That becomes a source of contention in the northern Susquehanna River Valley.
The governor of Pennsylvania also had to contend with a persistent threat from the South.
The Penns are also dealing with Virginians who are taking the area around Pittsburgh and claiming it for themselves. And so if he can strike a deal independently, then he can have a legal argument for why Pennsylvania has jurisdiction in this region. You also have speculators, a host of companies, really multinational companies, that are looking to use a new purchase to make good on their speculative investments in some of these Western lands. So there's a lot of interest at play.
These competing provincial, indigenous, and personal interests backed William Johnson into a corner.
Johnson's in a pickle.
Thomas Penn, the proprietor of Pennsylvania, offered to help for a price.
Thomas Penn sent a letter to Johnson telling him that he knows that Johnson has these private grants that he wants to get approved, and that Penn will help him get it approved in London if Johnson, for him, extends the line west of Wyoming to take in almost all of the northern Susquehanna River Valley, and does it independently of Connecticut and Virginia. Johnson responds that it was always his intention to do this.
But helping Penn risked incurring Lord Hillsborough's wrath if Johnson violated his orders not to go beyond the 1765 agreement.
Johnson therefore starts planning. He starts making comments about how Hillsborough made a mistake on his map, and therefore he needed to correct that mistake. The mistake that Johnson points out is that the map does not include a line north of Owego, and that the Haudenosaunee really wanted to make a deal for a line north of Owego to save their territory from incoming settlers and some problematic speculators who were conjuring up old deeds and agreements to get what they wanted. And he's saying, we need this line north or else everything will fall apart. But he's going to use the rationale to correct that mistake to extend the line everywhere and thus meet the agreements that he has made with Penn and with other speculators.
Johnson sent messages to native communities and provincial governments, inviting them to convene at Fort Stanwix near what is now Rome, New York, in September 1768. But violence nearly derailed the conference before it could even begin. On a frigid January day, 4 Seneca and 2 Mohicans visited the home of a German settler named Frederick Stump along Middle Creek in central Pennsylvania. Later, when he was found hiding in a nearby grist mill, Stump claimed that the 6 native people were drunk and that they had threatened him. Whether this was true, we cannot know, for Stump killed them all. He dragged their lifeless bodies to the creek, smashed open a hole in the ice, and pushed them under. The next day, Stump and John Ironcutter, his German-born indentured servant, walked 14 miles up the creek to a native community. There they found a woman, 2 young girls, and a baby. Stump would later claim he feared the woman would raise an alarm about the missing Seneca and Mohicans, which is why he and Ironcutter murdered them all. They dragged their bodies into a cabin and burned it. Like the Paxton Boys, who slaughtered Conestoga Indians in 1763, Stump never faced justice for his crimes. He was briefly imprisoned before being rescued by an armed mob.
Tensions were so high that John Penn, who's the governor of Pennsylvania, told William Johnson, "You've got to hold off on having this treaty at Fort Stanwix until our arrangements and until there's a better relationship with many of these northern and western nations."
The unrelated passing of a Seneca leader threatened further delays.
A Seneca leader has died, and many of the Susquehanna nations and Ohio nations make their way up through Seneca country to make their way over to Fort Stanwix, stop for a condolence ceremony for that recently deceased Seneca leader, and make their way then to Fort Stanwix. And Johnson thinks they're going to arrive in September. They don't. Instead, it's weeks of them in Seneca country, and Johnson's getting no news on their temper because there's all these rumors that French and Spanish agents have gone to the Susquehanna and Ohio nations and told them that Fort Stanwix is a ruse to get them all together and murder them all, which can't be far from their imagination because they just experienced the murder by Frederick Stump.
Johnson understood these concerns, but he also felt that the moment to conclude a new agreement was slipping away, and there was another problem. Johnson expected 3,000 native people to attend the conference, and that was terribly expensive.
It would require 150 barrels of pork and flour, not to mention several casks of alcohol and a whole host of gifts just for a week of negotiations. And from Johnson's perspective, he says he has to have all of these goods at this time, and he says otherwise it must overset the design of this Congress, as it cannot be supposed that hungry Indians can be kept here or in any temper without a belly full. That starts rolling in September. He cannot hold off negotiations. There's supposed to be over 3,000 indigenous people attending this Fort Stanwix Treaty. 1,000 of them arrive, and the other 2 are still in Seneca country waiting for a couple weeks. So now all the supplies that Johnson has maneuvered to get there are consumed. And he's panicking. He actually says, "I'm distressed," because he's going to have to justify added expenses to Hillsborough, to Gage, to a host of other people that he needs to keep happy because he's going to go against the precise instructions that Hillsborough has just given him. Johnson pleads with messengers to the Seneca nations to get everybody there. He promises a full condolence ceremony once they arrive, which will take days.
As Johnson promised, the condolence ceremony took place once the remaining delegates arrived in early October. Then, the negotiations began. As they had now for decades, the Haudenosaunee claimed the right to speak on behalf of the Ohio and Susquehanna nations. They dealt directly with Johnson, who spoke on behalf of the king and many other interests.
And it takes until the 3rd day when Johnson starts actually talking about the line. But much to his chagrin, they don't want to talk about the northern line first. They want to talk about the southern line, and particularly want to talk about their conquering of the Cherokee, and therefore selling what they have conquered in Cherokee country around the Tennessee River. And they said, if you don't give us this, it will irritate or offend our warriors who had conquered that country. What they want Johnson to do is recognize that fight, but also their sovereign authority over a vast territory in North America, which puts them in a significant position. And it also takes away threats to their own land closer to home.
With the Haudenosaunee satisfied with the southern boundary, the diplomats turned their gaze north to the more vexatious northern border. These negotiations followed a different course.
Once Johnson gets to the northern portion, he doesn't do it in these public meetings. Instead, he takes a map into his private quarters and brings the Oneida in, because much of that northern line is going to go through their territory, and starts negotiating with them. He even sweetens the pot. He offers $500 in gifts to each chief that gives him a quote-unquote favorable answer. The Oneida are like, we can't agree to this. This is too close to our doors. We barely have hunting country left.
It was a stratagem. Johnson wanted the Oneida to see one possible future on the map, one of white settlers vying for their lands.
They need to take it back, they said, to negotiate it in private with many of the Haudenosaunee and particularly their warriors. Johnson's banking on deference, that they will defer to their elders. That's going to be really difficult because many of the Seneca and Cayuga warriors don't want to give up anything. Because Johnson proposed a line that would have started at the Appalachian Mountains and moved through to the north, which would have taken all of the northern Susquehanna River Valley. And the Seneca warriors respond like, we will give nothing away between, and they say this specifically, Great Island and Wyoming, which means all of the northern Susquehanna River Valley. And that means, to me, that the Susquehanna nations, while not visible in council because they're treated as subject peoples and not visible in the treaty, actually do have some diplomatic authority behind the scenes.
The Oneida returned to the negotiations with an unwelcome answer.
The Oneida go back and they replicate the 1765 agreement. And then they agree to a line that's far more eastern than Johnson wanted. Johnson got angry. He gave this, what they called a warm speech, and said that they were going to undermine the whole purpose of this conference with such an agreement because it imposes on quote-unquote grants that were already given. And to my mind, he means the grants that were given to him. The Oneida go back. There's another, literally a week of negotiation almost, and they give a line that's a bit different now. They say, we're not going to go with the Appalachian Mountains. We're going to push it. We'll give you a line on the West Branch, which we never agreed to in 1765. But that's going to go up this creek called the Tiadata. It'll hit Burnett's Hills, and then it'll follow the North Branch up to Owego, and then an easterly course to Canada Creek. Johnson said not everything that we wanted, but it's better than the agreement that the Oneida gave a week before.
Content with the agreement over the northern boundary, Johnson also made good on his promises to the Penn family.
He struck a deal independent for Pennsylvania, and that's the only independent deal in this treaty. The Penns paid 10,000 Spanish dollars for all of the agreements within what they considered the jurisdiction of Pennsylvania based on charter rights. Johnson also got Haudenosaunee to go on the public record saying that they disavow the purchase in 1754 handed to the Susquehanna Company, and moreover, that the Haudenosaunee would never sell land in what is considered Pennsylvania to Connecticut. So now Penn's got a legal argument.
But the Treaty of Fort Stanwix was far from a perfect agreement.
Nobody's happy with the Fort Stanwix Treaty. The Haudenosaunee are divided. Many of the Seneca and Cayuga are upset that this deal was struck. They don't understand why they gave so much away in the north. The Susquehanna nations are really upset. At a meeting at Fort Augusta, which is in modern-day Sunbury, they tell the officers there that they're so upset that they believe the Haudenosaunee are, quote, the slaves of the white people. The Ohio nations are upset because they were there but never given the authority to negotiate, even though they live on those lands, which Johnson recognized. Connecticut's upset because it's been excluded from the deal, and so Connecticut just decides, we're just going to start moving there. Now Penn has to race Connecticut settlers to basically claim what he thinks he just purchased. Speculators are abuzz, obviously, but it irritates some other speculators because they don't get a chance to benefit from it because of the way Johnson's treaty went down.
And Johnson's antics infuriated Lord Hillsborough.
Hillsborough, once he gets news of the treaty, berates Sir William Johnson as bringing in private interests that he shouldn't have done, and from not following the precise instructions. And he actually goes back to Johnson and says, we're not going to approve this. You need to go back to the Haudenosaunee and renegotiate based on the precise instructions that I provided. Johnson can't do that because the Haudenosaunee will never accept it, especially the line to the south, which is what Hillsborough is worried about, because the line Johnson agreed to at Fort Stanwix went against the line that Cherokee just agreed with John Stewart, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Southern District. And Hillsborough's like, you've created so much confusion that is going to create another war. And he's right. But Johnson tells him, you can't do this. Oh, and by the way, this costs 20,000 pounds. And so renegotiation is going to be expensive. It might alienate the Haudenosaunee. And Hillsborough is in the middle of sort of rock and a hard place. Eventually, he tells Johnson, I would wish you renegotiate, but it's no longer a command, and we'll approve this treaty.
The Treaty of Fort Stanwix, negotiated with the Haudenosaunee, along with later agreements struck with the Cherokee, deflected white settlers away from their homelands and set in motion a mad scramble for the Susquehanna River Valley and the Ohio country. The new boundary lines raced towards the Ohio River and followed its course south toward what is now Kentucky and on to the Mississippi River. For Pennsylvanians, Virginians, and other colonists who had long prized these lands, this was their moment. Some, like the Virginia planter George Washington, ventured west to inspect old land grants and promising ground, while deputizing others to make new purchases on his behalf. Others were more ambitious. Robert Parkinson explains.
Back in London, there are very, very well-funded investors who are wanting to create an inland colony called Vandalia, which would incorporate all of what's today West Virginia, parts of eastern Ohio, and a lot of Kentucky. That would be its own massive, it's referred to almost as an internal kingdom.
The Cresap family was involved in the Vandalia scheme, and by the early 1770s, Thomas and his son Michael had significant experience in land speculation, provincial border disputes, and conflict with indigenous peoples.
Thomas Cresap comes to America at the very beginning of the 18th century from England. He's from Yorkshire. And he settles outside of Baltimore, and he bounces around. He rents lands from George Washington's father, and he settles on the Susquehanna River in the 1730s in what is today maybe 30 miles inside of Pennsylvania, but they think it's Maryland. And he gets this permission from the Maryland governor to settle there.
Like his son after him, Thomas became embroiled in a colonial border dispute.
This one is between Maryland and Pennsylvania. There are pitched battles between the two. Cresap shoots somebody who ends up dying, and he is arrested for murder once the Pennsylvanians get their hands on him, and he's clapped in a Philadelphia jail for a while. According to the charters, Philadelphia should have been in Maryland because the maps were so bad in the 18th century. So when he gets to Philadelphia, he says, "Damn, this isn't the prettiest town in Maryland."
Thomas Cresap's actions in the border dispute in the 1730s earned him the nickname the Maryland Monster. Those actions later led to the arrival of English surveyors Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon in 1763 to map the precise boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Once out of jail, Thomas, his wife Hannah, and their children moved west. Michael was born in 1742.
The Cresap family gets involved in the Ohio Company. They are original partners with the Washingtons and the Lees and the Fairfaxes. Thomas Cresap blazes the road to Pittsburgh for the Ohio Company. And in the years after the 7 Years' War, Michael is the leader of a settlement that is south of Pittsburgh. Today it's Brownsville, Pennsylvania, but then it was called Redstone on Redstone Creek. Michael is probably in his early 20s here, becomes a leading trader, and then when that doesn't work out so much, he opens a store that goes under.
Michael Cresap lent his customers credit on far too generous terms, and he struggled to stock his store in Redstone when his supplier in Frederick, Maryland, withheld orders, fearing that Cresap would disappear west, along with other settlers headed for the Ohio River Valley. The son of the Maryland Monster rode east to confront his supplier, apparently in a violent manner, and then proved his supplier right after all. Cresap left Redstone for Wheeling Creek along the Ohio River.
He becomes a land scout. He becomes one of the most important sort of speculators, settlers, quasi-soldiers of this territory in the 1760s and 70s.
By then, the now 30-year-old Cresap and his family had a long history of trading with indigenous peoples and fighting them.
The first time he comes to public knowledge is killing native peoples. In the conflicts of Pontiac's War, Thomas Cresap's home in Western Maryland becomes a centerpiece of some of the raids that happen. We always think of Pontiac's War as a war against the forts at Detroit and Fort Pitt especially, but there's a lot of country raiding going on as well. And one of that happens in what's called Old Town Maryland, Cresap's town in a lot of ways. And natives attack over 3 days. They send out very panicked, "Please help us." The messages back to the governor of Maryland. Thomas sends Michael, who is 21 at this point, to go for help, and he shows up in Frederick, Maryland wearing moccasins of a native person that he has killed. He's always, from a very young age, dealt with native conflict. His older brother was killed 5 years earlier in the 7 Years' War. and they came upon his dead body in the mountains, half chewed up by animals. This is someone who is up close and personal with the violence and trauma of these years and these places. That's not to say that he's not one of the main reasons why that violence and that trauma is happening, but it is happening to him.
By the early 1770s, James Logan Soyechtowa had moved deeper into the Ohio country as well. And like Michael Cressup, we cannot understand Logan without first understanding the life of Shekhelemi, his Oneida father.
Shekhelemi was one of the most important native diplomats of the 18th century. He's the Six Nations point person to try to keep the peace with all the things that are going on in the 1730s and 40s and 50s. He's sent to a town that's today Sunbury, Pennsylvania, but then it's called Shamokin. He is sent there as an ambassador to negotiate to keep the peace in central Pennsylvania. He is the lead native diplomat that organizes the very infamous walking purchase in 1737. And he does that in negotiation with and in alliance with James Logan, who is the land agent for Pennsylvania. And that relationship becomes so close that Shekhelemi gives his two oldest sons another name. He refers to them as Logan. The oldest brother, his name is Taknadorus, but he's also known as John Logan Shekhelemi. And the second-born son is James Logan Shekhelemi, but he's also known as Soyechtowa. And that epitomizes this kind of relationship, this tight bond between Pennsylvania and this one person, Shekhelemi.
When Shekhelemi died in 1748, his oldest sons, John and James Logan, Taknadorus and Soyechtowa, took up their father's diplomatic mantle. They tried to follow Shekhelemi's way, but their father's role in negotiating away Lenape lands in the walking purchase, their own role in the violence between settlers and native peoples that swept through Pennsylvania during the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's uprising, and the displacement of indigenous peoples like the Lenape and Shawnee diminished their political power and influence, complicating their diplomatic efforts. They abandoned Shekhelemi's name and with their families retreated west toward the Ohio River. Despite all of this, in the years after the war, some white settlers who encountered Logan near his home in what is now Reedsville, Pennsylvania, recalled a relatively friendly man who spoke some English and offered assistance when it was needed. Yet for Logan, and for many native peoples like the Shawnee and the Lenape, who colonists called the Delaware, peoples that inhabited western Pennsylvania, western Virginia, and lands west of the Ohio River, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768 was a disaster. However dissatisfied some native peoples and provincials may have been with Sir William Johnson's diplomatic triumph, the treaty resolved the problem of stopping settlers like the Cressup family from frequently defying the royal proclamation line by bending it to their will.
In the years after 1768, instead of preventing future expansion and speculation, Fort Stanwix starts the whole machine over again. I think there are 6 maybe Ohio native peoples who were at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. The treaty is there to please and placate and make happy the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee. The Ohios feel like their land has been sold out from under them, just like what happened before. And so tensions are rising and rising and rising and rising. And then there you see what's going on in Pittsburgh. And we're lighting fuses again on huge kegs of gunpowder.
Not all members of the Six Nations were pleased and placated. For people like Logan, who was of the Six Nations but not in them, the resurgence of white settlers heading west after 1768 had consequences far more personal. His family began to fracture.
The Mingo Indians are Iroquois who are displeased with what's going on at home. They're Iroquois speaking, and they are an amalgamation of a number of different, mostly Six Nations peoples who are creating their own groups that start in the North Branch of the Susquehanna, and eventually, by about 1770, a number of them have resettled even further to the south and west to the Ohio River. James Logan Soyechtowa becomes a leading member of that group. He takes his mother and his sister with him.
By 1770, Logan, his mother Neonoma, his sister Kune, and a younger brother known as John Petty were living in a Mingo village along Beaver Creek on the west side of the Ohio River, some 50 miles from Pittsburgh.
The family splits up. His older brother stays in central Pennsylvania. They never see each other again. So the family, which has been very tight and connected throughout all this bad stuff that happens, then finally does split apart in 1770.
2 years after Logan and his family resettled along the Ohio River, the British made a critical decision that altered the balance of power in the Ohio country. In one of his final acts as Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Hillsborough ordered General Thomas Gage, the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America, to withdraw the Army garrison from Fort Pitt. Both men had come to believe that maintaining a garrison at the forks of the Ohio River and one further west in the Illinois country was an unnecessary burden on the Treasury. After years of dealing with colonists who defied the proclamation line and provoked conflict with native peoples, Gage wasn't sorry to see the fort abandoned. As he told the Secretary of War, the colonists ought to live with the consequences of their own choices.
If the colonists will afterward force the savages into quarrels by using the mill, let them feel the consequences. We shall be out of the scrape.
By the time the British garrison withdrew in October 1772, Lord Hillsborough had been dismissed from office. In London, powerful land speculators involved with the Ohio Company and the proposed Vandalia colony had orchestrated his downfall. William Legge, Earl of Dartmouth, replaced him as the colonial secretary. The evacuation of British redcoats from Fort Pitt unnerved white settlers in the region. The trauma of indigenous raids during Pontiac's uprising still echoed in the forests and the glens. Rumors swirled that native warriors had been seen with painted faces, a sign they were going to war. Just before the withdrawal, when Logan was spotted in Pittsburgh, some colonists feared that his appearance was a herald of things to come. But as a local minister soon learned, Logan was just as troubled. After talking with him in town, the minister later encountered Logan in the woods, who told him,
"My house, the trees, and the air are full of devils. They continually haunt me, and they will kill me. All things tell me how wicked I have been."
To banish these devils and his wicked thoughts, the minister prescribed Logan prayer to little effect. The soldiers at Fort Pitt did more than just reassure white settlers who feared native attacks. They were an imperial presence that kept the long-simmering conflict between Virginia and Pennsylvania over the forks of the Ohio River at bay.
But once they leave, there's a huge power vacuum. Very rapidly after that, Pennsylvania Assembly extends the boundaries of Westmoreland County to encompass the village of Pittsburgh. And in response, the Virginians establish West Augusta County that also encompasses it. So it is both Pennsylvania and Virginia. And there are magistrates. There are two basically mayors of Pittsburgh, one from Virginia, one from Pennsylvania. There's also a contest going back and forth, letters between Governor John Penn and Governor Dunmore about these kinds of things. So you're seeing this imperial rivalry about who gets this territory and who can make their writ run in Pittsburgh.
John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, had been appointed Virginia's chief magistrate in 1771, after only a year serving in the same and more lucrative post in New York. The disappointed Dunmore decamped to Williamsburg, hoping that he would have little reason to linger long in the hot and humid Virginia air. But soon, the Scottish nobleman warmed to the prospect of expanding his colony's western borders into the Ohio country, defeating rival Pennsylvania's claims to Pittsburgh and winning the adulation of the Virginia gentry and the common people. He believed that the British withdrawal from Fort Pitt was his moment. In the summer of 1773, Lord Dunmore departed the coastal confines of Williamsburg and headed northwest into mountainous West Augusta County in what is now West Virginia, before pressing on to Fort Pitt to stake the Old Dominion's claims to land that Virginians and Pennsylvanians had been fighting over since before the 7 Years' War. As Lord Dunmore told the Earl of Dartmouth, when he arrived in the disputed region, he found a people desperately in want of local government and order who pleaded with him for help.
Upon my arrival, the people flocked about me and beseeched me, not only as they were His Majesty's subjects, but likewise as they were of those within the government over which I preside, to appoint magistrates and officers of militia to remove these grievous inconveniences under which they labored. I found upwards of 10,000 people settled, and that they had neither magistrates to preserve rule and order among themselves, nor militia for their defense in case of any sudden attack of the Indians.
Dunmore felt it was his duty to appoint magistrates and officers for the good of the king's subjects in Western Virginia, carefully obscuring the fact that Governor John Penn had done much the same for the good of the king's subjects in Western Pennsylvania. The contest between the Pennsylvania and Virginia governments and between settlers on the ground led to a great deal of confusion, no small amount of chaos, and violence.
There are magistrates who have some sort of official standing. They've been given commissions of things. John Connolly, who is Dunmore's man, he's made a captain-commandant of Pittsburgh. He has blank certificates to make anybody a militia captain. And so he has a number of deputies that he sends there, and they go and break into the Pennsylvania magistrates' houses. One of the Pennsylvanians' wife is attacked. She's hit by a sword in one attack, and she's badly scratched in another attack. There's all sorts of violence spilling out into their homes. At one point, they're kidnapped and taken to Stanton, Virginia. And the Pennsylvanians do the same thing. They go in the middle of the night into John Connolly's house and roust him out of bed and haul him off to the Westmoreland, Pennsylvania jail. They're bullying and attacking each other.
For ordinary settlers, who to support, Pennsylvania or Virginia, wasn't always immediately obvious.
There's a lot of people going back and forth. You can almost see it as a microcosm of what's about to happen to the continent in general. A lot of them don't have a lot of ties to one or the other. I think the Virginians probably have a little bit more of an advantage in that a lot of those settlers come from either Western Maryland or Virginia, and so they feel a little bit more beholden to Dunmore and the Old Dominion. But the Pennsylvanians, a lot of those guys are very recent immigrants. Maybe in the last 6 or 7 years, they've come to the New World, and so they don't really care all that much about Pennsylvania per se. They're not really attached to it.
They cared more about who could best ensure order and stability in the region, a peace Dunmore argued that he could best provide when he visited Fort Pitt in the summer of 1773.
The other question is, what are Native peoples who are seeing all this craziness? What are they thinking of this? And that's really where the conflict then immediately turns to, is seeing all this chaos and street fighting, and Native peoples are watching this. And I think the easiest conclusion is, when is this going to come at us? And it very rapidly does by March and April. And that, in many ways, is a benefit to certainly the Virginians, because then they can close ranks and say, well, we have to fight this exterior threat. We have to stop fighting with one another.
Governor Dunmore waited for months, until March 1774, to inform Lord Dartmouth that he had extended Virginia's government to the forks of the Ohio River, lest the king's ministers stop him before he could act to strengthen Virginia's claims.
Dunmore loves to ask forgiveness, not permission. That's one of his key attributes. He'll do things, and then it'll be months before he writes home to tell anybody what he's done.
By the time that Dartmouth received Dunmore's letter in May, Virginians had already massacred Logan's family at Yellow Creek. In April 1774, as confusion and bewilderment reigned at the forks of the Ohio, violence erupted along the Ohio River. On the 14th, a trader named William Butler sent 3 employees and a canoe full of goods downstream from Pittsburgh to trade at a Shawnee village. When they stopped to camp for the night, they encountered 4 Cherokees traveling in the area. The traders foolishly
Show that they have silver in a bag to some natives who they don't really know, and they get robbed of their silver, and one of them gets killed in the fracas, and somebody else also gets hurt and wounded.
The robbery by the Cherokees, along with a report from a Shawnee man that the Ohio Seneca would soon strike against settlers, and other rumors that the Shawnee themselves would attack, raised alarms among colonists in the area. John Connolly, Lord Dunmore's commandant at Fort Pitt, saw this as a moment of opportunity.
Connolly says, aha, here's my chance let's close ranks and go after these guys. And he literally, in his journal, turns a new page on his journal and talks about now the expedition and the fight against the Indians, as if all the other stuff between Virginia and Pennsylvania is not happening anymore. Now this is going to become a fight with native peoples.
Connolly circulated letters warning settlers not to provoke friendly native peoples and to defend themselves in case a general war broke out.
In the last week of April, there are really bad things happening all up and down the Ohio River. Michael Cressup is involved in some of those things.
4 days after the Cherokees attacked William Butler's men, a surveying party marking out lands for George Washington along the Kanawha River encountered a settler who told them of a fight between colonists and native peoples that left 3 natives dead. At a council among Ohio natives in the wake of the fight, they decided to kill the Virginians and rob the Pennsylvanians.
80 years ago, we would talk about Indians and tribes, but Pennsylvania's a tribe, and Virginia's a tribe, and Maryland's a tribe, and some of those tribes are more warlike, the Virginians, and some of them are more inclined to trade and peace, the Pennsylvanians. And natives see it that way. They talk in the 1770s in some of these conferences, they talk about the colonists in terms of tribes, just exactly like they talk about one another.
Some native peoples called the Virginians the Long Knives in recognition of their warlike nature. After hearing the tale of the surveying party's encounter, a young Long Knife named George Rogers Clark was among the Virginians who gathered at Point Pleasant to plan a retaliatory attack against a Shawnee village. Knowing that Michael Cressup was scouting land nearby, they sent for him and asked him to lead the expedition. To Clark's surprise, Cressup declined. He told the group he didn't doubt that a general Indian war was coming, but he didn't want to be blamed for starting it. Yet within days, Connolly sent Cressup a note addressing him as Captain Cressup, ordering him and his men to scout the countryside. They went scouting for targets instead. On April 26, Cressup's men killed a Shawnee and a Lenape who were canoeing downstream to Shawnee villages on the Scioto River. They were traveling with the lone survivor of the Cherokee attack from days earlier. That man dove into the water when the shooting started, and despite Cressup's denials, he believed Cressup's men had pulled the triggers. The next day, Cressup's men attacked canoes carrying the Shawnee leader Cornstalk, with at least some Shawnee killed and some colonists wounded. When they returned to Wheeling that evening, Cressup's men vowed to attack a Mingo camp about 30 miles upriver from them. Logan was at that camp. They began to march, and then...
For some reason, Michael says, hey guys, this is a bad idea. Let's turn around and go back, which aggravates those men who were looking for blood. For some reason, Michael thinks, yeah, I don't like the looks of this. This is probably not great.
Cressup told the men that
it was generally agreed that those Mingo Indians had no hostile intentions, as they were hunting, and their party was composed of men, women, and children with all their stuff.
As they returned to camp, the party encountered John Gibson and 3 other traders canoeing downriver. Gibson was Logan's brother-in-law. He spent a frightening night in camp, filled with more than 100 men, some of whom threatened to kill him for trading with the enemy. The next morning, Cressup all but told Gibson he could no longer control his men, that they meant to fall on and kill every Indian they met on the river. Cressup left camp that day and headed east. Gibson continued downriver.
I don't know what it is. I don't know if he just doesn't like the look of what's going to happen, but he takes steps to try to distance himself from Yellow Creek. It does not work.
Logan was away from Yellow Creek hunting on Saturday, April 30th, 1774.
Yellow Creek is about 50 miles downstream from Pittsburgh. Yellow Creek dumps into the Ohio River from the west.
And in the days prior, some shots had rang out across the Ohio River.
There's a minor skirmish that happens, and so an arrangement is made to try to keep the peace. People send emissaries up to the Mingo settlement that is about a mile up Yellow Creek to say, why don't you guys come over to a tavern run by Joshua Baker and his wife called Baker's Bottom. Why don't you come over to Baker's Bottom, just have a drink with us. We will go through the negotiations of peace to make sure that nothing further happens as a result of this. Let's come over on Saturday morning. The people that they're talking to are these descendants of Shechelemi who've been raised to listen to these kinds of opportunities and a chance to keep the peace. It's no surprise that it is the wife of Shechelemi and the daughter of Shechelemi and one of the sons of Shechelemi and about 4 other Mingos who paddle down Yellow Creek and cross the Ohio River in the hopes of keeping the peace. This is what the family has been raised to do. This is what they do.
Logan's mother, Neonoma, his younger brother, John Petty, his sister Kune and her baby girl, and 3 other men crossed the river that morning.
It's a trap. A few of them go into the front room of the tavern and have a drink.
After some time passed,
Someone proposed a shooting contest. See who can hit this thing over there first.
John Petty remained inside while some of the men headed outside for the contest.
And the colonists say, why don't you guys go first? And the point being to unload their weapons.
Back inside the tavern, a British officer's coat belonging to Nathan Tomlinson was hanging on the wall. John Petty allegedly took it down, put it on, and began strutting around, taunting the white men. Tomlinson threatened to kill him if he didn't give his coat back.
There's some scuffling. Again, tensions are at their highest point. Some hard words are exchanged, partly after some alcohol has been consumed, alcohol being another kind of colonial weapon.
One of the colonists shot Petty as he made for the door.
And as soon as the shooting starts, unbeknownst to the Mingo, there are somewhere between 10, maybe even as high as 20 people hiding in another room, a back compartment of Baker's Bottom.
Edward King knifed John Petty to death. Outside, Neonoma was killed, and Kune began to run with her baby girl.
Kune, with her baby, runs, tries to reach the Ohio River, get back in her canoe. She's stopped right as she gets to the riverbank. She turns around and begs for the child to be spared. They hand over the child and they shoot her in the forehead and kill her. They have a debate on whether or not to kill the child. They don't.
In the same moment, the colonists fired on native peoples who began paddling across the river when they heard the first shots, killing some of them. When the gunfire ended, the attackers heard something they never forgot.
They tell stories of the moans and the wails of the women on the other side of the river that wafted across the water. They could hear the screaming and yelling from Mingo women on the other side about what they had known had happened.
The colonists left the tavern with Kune's baby girl. They later returned her to her father, the trader John Gibson, who at the time of the killings was far downriver visiting Shawnee villages. Just when Logan learned of the Yellow Creek massacre, we do not know. But we do know
Logan is broken by this. Everybody understands after this happens that Logan has to seek revenge. Whenever they try to tamp the lid down on what happens after this, everybody says, yeah, except for Logan. Like, let's not go to war with the Virginians. The Shawnees shouldn't go to war with the Virginians, or the Delaware shouldn't. But Logan has permission to do whatever he wants to do. And everybody kind of understands that. Logan then initiates a set of about 4 different raids that are increasingly ghastlier and ghastlier as we go along into June and then in August and into September. And by that, you can see that what has happened to his family, the Shechelemi way, for the most part, I can still see traces of it. There are still some moments in which he pulls back and tries to limit the violence, but what he has been taught to do is broken by Yellow Creek.
Logan's quest for vengeance encompassed a wide geography. In the first week of June, Logan and several warriors attacked the Spicer family farm near Redstone, Pennsylvania. They killed William and his wife Lydia. 3 of their children never had a chance. They took 2 more children captive. The attack near Redstone, the Cressup family's seat, was no accident. In his grief, Logan came to believe that Michael Cressup was the architect of his family's slaughter at Yellow Creek. It wasn't an unreasonable assumption given the Cressup's role in recent events, but he was 30 miles away when the attack took place.
Who exactly tells him that this is Michael Cressup's fault? I don't know. Logan definitely believes it.
Word of Logan's raid reached Philadelphia and Williamsburg, as well as the ears of Sir William Johnson in northern New York. In early July, Johnson convened an emergency conference with 600 Iroquois at Johnson Hall, his home, hoping to stave off a full-scale war. he would not live to see peace. 2 hours after delivering an opening speech in which he pledged that the British would bring the attacking colonists to justice, the 59-year-old Anglo-Irishman, long the fulcrum on which the British alliance with the Haudenosaunee rested, collapsed and died. The next day, hundreds of miles to the south, Logan struck in western Virginia.
In the second set of raids, he takes a couple of people captive, and one of them knows how to read and write. We know Logan can read, but I don't think he can write because of what he does here. He adopts Robinson, a Virginia colonist, and he preserves his life, and he goes and visits this guy a couple of different times and gives him a piece of paper and says, write down what I'm going to say.
To Captain Cressup, what did you kill my people on Yellow Creek for? The white people killed my kin at Conestoga a great while ago, and I thought nothing of that. But you killed my kin again on Yellow Creek and took my cousin prisoner. Then I thought I must kill too, and I have been 3 times to war since. But the Indians is not angry, only myself.
In that he says, this is not between the colonists and all Indians. This is me and you, brother. Why don't we meet somewhere and we'll settle this out, man to man here. That is a way of limiting the violence. There's an appearance there of the old Chekalemi way that surfaces when he writes that note.
Logan carried that note with him as he turned south toward the Liebrook farm on Sinking Creek, deep in Virginia. He had with him the War Club carved with his initials as well. By then, Lord Dunmore had begun assembling a Virginia army to conquer the Ohio country, using the outbreak of violence along the river that spring to justify calling out the militia.
Dunmore has realized fantastic opportunities in escalating a war with Native peoples. It solves the problem of Pittsburgh and makes it theirs, and then there are future potential conquests to come if we can subdue what is today the eastern half of Ohio. Fantastic. We can line our pockets with tremendous amounts of gold. Dunmore sends 2 wings of an army, one north to Pittsburgh to come down the Ohio River, and one overland across the mountains of West Virginia. They're going to meet at a place called Point Pleasant, where the Kanawha River meets the Ohio River. Logan goes very close to where they're gathering for that southern wing of the army in his raids in August. He gets really close to some pretty dangerous territory.
On August 7th, 1774, a Sunday, Logan and 3 other warriors stalked the Liebrook, Sidnoe, and McGriff families at the Liebrook farm along Sinking Creek. As they vanished into the woods with the scalps of 7 children and 3 other children in tow as captives, Logan dropped his war club with his note tied around it.
When he does that, he drops the club and the note in a way, I think, to be very loud. He's not trying to be silent in these things. He's trying to do what he can to stop that southern wing of the army from just raiding and killing more and more and more of his people, his children. He's killing children so his children won't get killed. That club is meant to terrify, and it does actually. It has a significant effect on recruitment for that Southern Army. That Southern Army is delayed for weeks because they can't get enough people because no one wants to leave their women and children vulnerable to go volunteer and march in an army. The note doesn't work very much, but the club very much works. That's what a diplomat does. That's what a political strategist does.
Logan's warning could only delay the southern wing of Dunmore's army for so long. He soon headed south to raid in what is now eastern Tennessee. In the meantime, the royal governor led the northern wing of the army of 1,700 men from Fort Pitt down the Ohio River. The southern wing, with 1,100 men led by Andrew Lewis, moved west across the mountains toward the junction of the Kanawha and Ohio rivers. They intended to attack Shawnee villages, but the 2 wings of the army never linked up.
The Shawnees, under the leadership of Cornstalk, realizes that these 2 wings are about to join and we should not let that happen. So he engages the Southern Army, who arrives at Point Pleasant first on the 10th of October, 1774, and this is right in the middle of the First Continental Congress. In one of the biggest battles in American history between natives and colonists, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 natives we think are there, and more colonists are there than that, but it's a significant engagement that goes on for hours and hours and hours.
Cornstalk led a coalition of Shawnee, Delaware, Mingo, and Wyandots against the Virginians. When it was over, the Virginians had lost 75 men with another 140 wounded. The native Confederacy lost dozens, but they threw many of their dead in the river to conceal their losses. As one Virginian put it, with considerable understatement,
"We had a very hard day."
Learning of the battle, Dunmore crossed the Ohio River with his wing of the army and marched west toward Pickaway Plains near what is now Circleville, Ohio. The governor established Camp Charlotte, named for the British Queen, just miles from a major Shawnee village.
The Shawnees are not broken, but they are soundly defeated. And Cornstalk is convinced by some of the people around him that we can't continue this, and so they're going to negotiate.
As Cornstalk and his people deliberated before the talks with Dunmore, Logan arrived in the Shawnee village, having just returned from his raid in East Tennessee. He had not been at the Battle of Point Pleasant, nor would he attend the upcoming Treaty of Camp Charlotte, where the Shawnee would give up their claims to land south and east of the Ohio River, finishing what the Treaty of Fort Stanwix had started.
It was a good thing that Logan did not. Had he actually gone, the first sentry he would have encountered at Camp Charlotte would have been one of the people who was at Yellow Creek. He was the officer of the day on that day. And Michael Cresap, of course, is there at Camp Charlotte. And there are a number of Cresaps there, not just Michael, but his brother and his two nephews. So Logan decides to make himself scarce.
Logan still blamed Cresap for his family's deaths, but the weight of vengeance was a heavy load to bear. He was done fighting. In the days ahead, he would release his captives as a token of peace. Finding that his brother-in-law, John Gibson, was in the village, an agitated Logan asked Gibson to join him under the branches of a great elm tree. He had a story to tell, his own since the beginning of the last Great War, one that began not far from where he and Gibson rested under that tree. Gibson watched as his brother-in-law composed himself after shedding an abundance of tears. And then Logan began to speak. In the centuries to come, Logan's lament would become twisted to mean something it did not, an allegory for banishing native peoples, an oration recited by the descendants of British Americans as they pushed further west. But under that elm tree, in a Shawnee village in Pickaway Plains, it was a far more personal history of what had been lost in the rivers, the mountains, and the woods of the Ohio country.
I appealed to any white man. If he entered Logan's cabin hungry, and he gave him not meat. If ever he came cold and naked, and he clothed him not. During the course of that long and bloody war, Logan remained idle in his cabin, an advocate for peace. Such was my love for the whites, that my countrymen pointed as they passed and said, "Logan is the friend of white men." I had even thought to have lived with you, but for the injuries of one man, Colonel Cresap, the last spring, in cold blood and unprovoked, murdered all the relations of Logan, not sparing even my women and children. There runs not a drop of my blood in the veins of any living creature. This called on me for revenge. I have sought it. I have killed many. I have fully glutted my vengeance. For my country, I rejoice at the beams of peace. But do not harbor a thought that mine is the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not turn on his heel to save his life. Who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one.
"200 miles downriver from Pittsburgh, some of Lord Dunmore's officers gathered in Fort Gower. Michael Cresap was among them. It was Saturday, November 5th, 1774. The Virginians had constructed Fort Gower at the confluence of the Ohio and Hocking Rivers, a temporary camp built by the provincial army as they marched west against the Shawnee and their allies during Dunmore's war. The officers were not unaware that Parliament had passed the Coercive Acts to punish Bostonians for destroying the tea in their harbor. But as they would write when they returned to Fort Gower after the Battle of Point Pleasant, we have lived about 3 months in the woods without any intelligence from Boston or from the delegates at Philadelphia. In the days since they had returned to the fort, they had learned that the Continental Congress had called for the Continental Association, a trade boycott on British goods, in escalation of this very alarming crisis. As Virginians would soon read in their newspapers, the veterans of Dunmore's War were ready to do their part. In a series of resolves at Fort Gower, they pledged
the most faithful allegiance to His Majesty King George III, whilst His Majesty delights to reign over a brave and free people, that we will, at the expense of life and everything dear and valuable, exert ourselves in support of the honor of His crown and the dignity of the British Empire.
but warned.
We can live weeks without bread or salt, that we can sleep in the open air without any covering but that of the canopy of heaven, and that our men can march and shoot with any in the known world.
And resolved that,
As the love of liberty and attachment to the real interests and just rights of America outweigh every other consideration, we resolve that we will exert every power within us for the defense of American liberty and for the support of her just rights and privileges, not in any precipitate, riotous, or tumultuous manner, but when regularly called forth by the unanimous voice of our countrymen.
Michael Cressup would soon make good on that promise. Just over 2 months after the king's subjects fired on each other at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts Bay, Michael Cressup began raising a company of men in Maryland. In July 1775, Cressup and his men began the long march from Maryland north to Boston, a town where a rebel force was now laying siege to His Majesty's soldiers. Thanks for listening to Worlds Turned Upside Down. Worlds is a production of R2 Studios, part of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. I'm your host, Dr. Jim Ambuske. This episode of Worlds is made possible with support from a 2024 grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Head to r2studios.org to find a complete transcript of today's episode and suggestions for further reading. Worlds is researched and written by me, with additional research, writing, and script editing by Jeanette Patrick. Jeanette Patrick and I are the executive producers. Grace Mallon is our British correspondent. Our lead audio editor for this episode is Kurt Dahl of CD Squared. Annabelle Spencer is our graduate assistant. Our thanks to Robert Parkinson and Christopher Pearl for sharing their expertise with us in this episode. Thanks also to our voice actors, Adam Smith, Ann Fertig, John Terry, and Evan McCormick. Subscribe to Worlds on your favorite podcast app. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.